it's important to remember that September 1st, or September 11th, 2001 was Canada's participation in the War on Terror began right away. Although we got told we were slow and that Chrétien wasn't vocal enough in his support for us all being Americans or us all being New Yorkers or whatever the term of the day was at that time, Canada's war in Afghanistan was justified as retribution for 9/11. The Liberals did it, but of course the Conservatives, who carry out liberal policy with a little bit more crude language and a little bit more clarity in their language, vulgarity if you will, they brought that out right away with the election. And just before actually Harper's election, he traveled to Afghanistan and told the troops the exact number of Canadians that were killed in the World Trade Center, which was apparently at that time 20, and said that that's why we're here. We're here on a mission of quote unquote retribution. This isn't my term; it's their term. So Canada begins the global war on terror, and the global war on terror, crafted under the National Security Strategy of the United States in 2002, right after September 11th, was framed in terms of a global insurgency. Okay, and so the idea was that the nation state, the concept of the nation state, which was dwindling in the 1990s and gave way to the sort of anti-globalization movement and the idea of these sort of extra governmental bodies like the World Trade Organization, the WTO, and or the World Bank and IMF, and these kind of things actually running the show rather than the nation state as it is, really changed the paradigm of warfare, or really accelerated the paradigm of warfare that was changing since the Cold War ended. The idea that for the previous 50 years, the armies of the Western world, again, just to use the general term, the Western world, trained basically for an idea of a mechanized battle in Central Europe, tanks against tanks, planes in the air, Top Gun dogfighting, and this kind of thing. And of course, if you look at the wars that were fought since the end of the Cold War and the end of, say, the 1990s, you're dealing with conflicts like Somalia, conflicts like the Palestinian territories, like South Lebanon. These kind of ideas where you have states within a state. You have the concept of the nation state is dwindling, and Canada's jumping up on this concept. So I want to talk about this because this is crucial, because this goes beyond Afghanistan, and Afghanistan just happens to be the place. And I'll use the terminology of a laboratory. So Afghanistan serves as a laboratory for what is the transformation of Canadian foreign policy from top to bottom. So in other words, when the war in Afghanistan ends, the Canadian foreign policy transformation exists and carries on to the next war, wherever that war may be. And of course, always these wars are focused on at home, because defense is supposed to be first and foremost to protect the government on its local turf. So we can always keep that in mind. And many of these apparatuses that we'll talk about, the Special Forces and the sort of JTF-2, Joint Task Force 2 Special Forces, many of these in Canadian conceptions were born out of wars against, born out of Indian wars, wars against natives that go back in time, but also as recent as the Oka standoff. The conception that Canada has been using, and that you can see from the Liberals and the Conservatives, has been a 3D model, so defense, diplomacy, and development operating hand in hand. On a military level, there's been a mirror policy of a 3-block war. That is the idea that forces could be fighting on 3 simultaneous blocks. And I was hoping we might have one of those classrooms where you can use this sort of technology, but we don't quite have that. But I had one of those really amazing days about a year ago, when I was speaking at a high school in Ontario, and there happened to be Canadian Forces recruiting in the lobby, and I got talking with the recruiter, and he sort of said, we're here to recruit, why are you here? And I said, I'm talking about Canadian foreign policy in a classroom full of students. And so he gave me this, and if you look, we've got sort of really nice font. People can come up and hold it afterwards. But I'll read just right off this, because this is for the high school kids, so people don't think I'm accessing secret documents or something. Full spectrum operations. The Canadian Forces have adopted a full spectrum operations approach for the Afghanistan mission. This means that within the distance of 3 city blocks, soldiers could be simultaneously involved in fighting to suppress terrorism, assuring security, and providing humanitarian assistance. So these 3 things happening simultaneously: development, diplomacy or policing, imperial constabulary, happening alongside the military front that we see in Afghanistan. I want to bring this kind of thing up because it's important with the way that the 3Ds work together to understand in the Canadian political conception that you have the way the 3D is working and the three-block war is working. You basically have agreement across the Canadian political spectrum for this type of interventionist expeditionary policy, because even while the NDP say less military, they say less military but more aid and more diplomacy. But in the conception of the global insurgency, these three things are inextricable. They operate together, and you can't just pull one from the other. So in fact, if you have the NDP, if you had an NDP government, increasing aid and diplomacy while you have Marines on the ground in Afghanistan fighting the combat, it's in fact actually, as far as Canadians, that's a worse off approach for us, because we actually have less control over our armed forces because the armed forces are actually Marines. And the Marines, incidentally, are working on a three-block war model as well. This is a Marine Corps model founded by Charles Krulak in the mid-1990s. And the idea of the three-block war, when he named the term three-block war, it was a speech in which he talked about how the next wars were going to be, we're not going to be the Gulf War, but we're going to be the stepchild of Chechnya. So this is the middle of 1990s. You have the Russians laying waste to the entire province, country of Chechnya, nation of Chechnya, to fight this insurgency that cannot be defeated without totally razing the place. This is where these doctrines are born, okay? And then they were told they're peacekeeping and such, but these are where these models are born. So let's look at sort of the three main ideas of these. You've got policy, you've got doctrine. So policy on the government level and on the military level, you've got the doctrine, the actual manuals that they're operating on. Then you've got the procurement, so what material is our armed forces buying? How are they restructuring themselves? How's the foreign policy establishment restructuring itself? These kind of things, these are major ships, right? Big boats. It takes a long time to turn the bureaucracy of Ottawa around. So when you have transformation of Canadian foreign policy from top to bottom, this is something we're going to be facing for the next 50 years. These things don't just change overnight. And these, confronting these ideas, the last line of those three, policy, doctrine, procurement, but then you have the deeds. You can see what Canadian forces are doing around the world. And we talked a little bit about history, but it's important to understand that Canada doesn't jump on the global war on terror out of nowhere, right? We have hand-in-hand policy with the United States dating back quite some time, but sort of the peace movement in Canada likes to talk about sort of ballistic missile defense in Iraq as examples of sort of independent Canadian foreign policy, but it makes way more sense to look at the things that we share with the United States. So you can look and we'll start in 1991, where Canada's deeply involved in the war in Iraq, in the Gulf War, the first Gulf War, both flying Air Force and with Navy. We used our Navy throughout the decade of the 1990s to enforce a blockade on the people of Iraq that the United Nations humanitarian reparteur called, genocidal. We've seen these statistics that were, put on 60 Minutes, not secret statistics about 500,000 kids that died as a result of not being able to access the most basic medicines because Canadian warships are blocking these. Somalia in 1993, of course, we don't really need to get into the Somalia affair. Rwanda, Haiti, in both 94 and 2004, where Canada's involved in the overthrow of Aristide's government in 2004. Of course, Bosnia, Croatia in the mid-90s. You have Kosovo in 1999, which was a crucial erosion of the pillars of international law, where you had NATO carrying out, without a UN mandate, a 78-day bombing of Belgrade, which Canada took part in. Flying more than 700 sorties in these 70 days, so basically constantly in the air. 1998 Desert Fox is when the Monica Lewinsky combination with the bombing of Iraq, and Lloyd Axworthy ends up, human security agenda. Lloyd Axworthy ends up being the sort of front and center person justifying the bombing of Iraq at that time. Oil for food, 98 to 2003, Canada deeply integrated. Afghanistan, of course, Sudan, 2004. Israel and Lebanon, of course. Stephen Harper was the most vocal supporter of Israel's bombardment of South Lebanon, which killed 1,500 people. You can add Pakistan, the federally administered tribal areas, Northwest Frontier Province, CEDA, Canadian International Development Agency, giving aid in Pakistan tribal areas. And of course the Palestinian territories, which is where I do most of my work, and you have Canadian forces. You actually have a Canadian forces deployment to Jerusalem right now, training anti-government special forces, Contras, to overthrow the democratically elected Hamas government. We actually have Canadian colonels on the ground doing this work. This is not an American project, it's a Canadian project. So examples of this, of course, are on and on and on. And you can pick any place to start, right? With the insurgency is the idea of a global insurgency. I mean, the concept of the insurgency goes back to the beginning of the United States, where they used counterinsurgency tactics against the natives, divide and conquer, ghettoization, reservations. You can pick your terms. In Vietnam, they were called strategic hamlets. In Palestine, they're called cantons. In South Africa, they were called Bantustans. And we called them reservations, and we coined the idea. Canada fought in the Boer War, where the whole concept of the concentration camp was coined in the Boer War, and Canada fought in that war because the British came over and recruited prairie settlers because they were tough, obviously tough, if they were moving to the prairies and setting up shop. And so these the history of the insurgency, it doesn't begin September 11th, but what you crucially have on September 11th is a window of opportunity, a strategic clarity for Canadian forces to carry out a program of restructuring both the Canadian forces, which is one thing, but the entire foreign policy establishment, where you have aid being used as counterinsurgency. Which for Canada, aid was always was feeding sick babies, right? But in the United States, aid has always been counterinsurgency. Aid has always been funding the Contras. I mean, this goes back to Noam Chomsky's, and Ed Herman's books in the 70s, tracking the relationship between Amnesty International, human rights violators, and recipients of United States aid. I mean, in another country, this stuff's obvious. In Canada, it's a revelation. But it's important to keep it in mind because if we continue to organize against a war in Afghanistan to withdraw troops, it's very possible we'll get what we lobby for 11 years after the war started in 2011, that Canadian troops will withdraw, and then all of a sudden the peace movement has to completely redefine our strategy because all of a sudden we got what we wanted, yet we have provincial reconstruction teams on the ground, special forces on the ground carrying out development projects in Afghanistan. You have strategic advisory teams embedded within the Afghan government, key advisors of the military. I mean, Rick Hillier bragged before he became Canadian Chief of Defence Staff that he was the #1 advisor for Hamid Karzai's military project. So you have Canadians deeply ingrained within the entire structure of a government that there's not really time to go on about, but a government that is deeply illegitimate in Afghanistan and full of some of the most corrupt and brutal elements that someone could possibly imagine having in a government that's not supported by Canada, but in fact, the crucial support by Canada, in fact, like the key advisor kind of support, not this sort of rhetorical support and help in speech writing. I brought all this stuff that I wanted to tell you guys, and I haven't even turned the first page yet. And I brought all these props because Canadian naval deployments, since the global war on terror, we never talk about the Navy, but there's been 31 naval deployments since 1991 to the Gulf. And we're looking at a map. Again, I was hoping to have the kind of mappings, but you can see the naval deployments. If you can imagine the entire world, it's empty of Canadian warships virtually, other than training exercises and the occasional goodwill mission. Yet what you have here is what the United States area of responsibility is called Central Command. So just to give you an idea what we're talking about, this is Pakistan here, and this is Somalia here, and of course this is the Middle East, Straits of Hormuz. Well, look at the Canadian naval deployments. I mean, you can see just by those circles, you have naval deployments in the most key strategic areas of the global war on terror. What are these ships doing? They're providing crucial support to United States aircraft carriers. What are United States aircraft carriers doing? They're the platforms for the bombing of Iraq and Afghanistan. It's not well known that the planes, the expensive billion-dollar American planes, don't actually land, by and large, in Iraq and Afghanistan because it's it's too dangerous. There's no point in attempting to land these planes. They might get shot out of the sky, so they land them. Sometimes they land in the United States. I mean, the B-2 bombers can fly across the world, carry out a bombing mission, and land in Kansas. But the rest of them are actually landing on these aircraft carriers that are floating off the coast, these nuclear-powered aircraft carriers with 6,000 soldiers and sailors on board, and 125 different types of, or 125 different planes that are carrying out constant bombing missions. If you go to Victoria, if you go to Esquimalt, the Canadian Forces Naval Base in Esquimalt, and you go there to talk to them about this stuff, all they want to do is tell you about the role of Canadian Navy in the War on Terror. If you were to read the newspaper every day, you'd be forgiven for not knowing that we have Canadian forces constantly patrolling the Straits of Hormuz, the crucial piece of land that runs between the Gulf states and Iran, right from the Persian Gulf to the Arabian Sea, where at any given day 20% of world oil export is going through at any given moment. To say nothing of the fact that we have Canadian warships right off the coast of Iran, so when you're reading about cat and mouse games between the Iranian Republican Guard naval forces and American warships, which of course are what always lead to war, one random incident that has to be responded to is what always leads to war, Gulf of Tonkin, on and on and on. You have Canadian warships right there. Patrolling the Straits of Hormuz, one deployment will patrol the Straits of Hormuz 150 times in a few months, constantly going through these areas. So it's a fundamental shift what's happening, and for the most part, it's not talked about at all. But what it gives is Canada a place at the table. Stephen Harper calls it that Canada wants to be a player. And James Apathorai, who actually went a wonderful trajectory that should be really important for us all to pay attention to, went from the CBC, the Department of National Defense, to NATO's chief spokesperson. He said this when he was describing with George Stroumboulopoulos, trying to dumb down the news of what goes on in world affairs for this new hour television show. Apathorai said, no, listen, you don't get it, because he says, I didn't understand this when I worked at the CBC or the DND, but he says, quote, when you get above the wall, you see that the whole world is a chessboard and that they're connecting everything, the capital T, they, right? They're connecting everything. If you do this for me now, in 6 months, I'll do this. And if you don't do it, then I'll withhold this other thing, which seems totally unrelated. I'll hold it hostage. This is the kind of idea, that it's not necessarily, for Canadians, we say, why is Canada in Afghanistan? Some people say, oh, because it's because of a pipeline, right? A pipeline that's going to run through Afghanistan, and that's why Canadian forces are there. That may be one reason why Canadian forces are there, but it doesn't matter what the country is. The point is, it's a laboratory. It's the key focal point of foreign policy. And so it creates, and just to take a step back, it was popular. If people can remember, October 2001, there wasn't a lot of Canadians saying, don't invade Afghanistan. I mean, they might have in their living room, but they definitely weren't on the streets. If people who were on the streets remember looking around wondering where everyone else was, or if people were a part of the anti-globalization movement that ended in one day, and wondered where the rest of these people went, this is the kind of strategic environment, the strategic clarity that came about allowed the radical advancement of Canadian foreign policy, and it's created partially something that can be exploited, and that is this sort of what they're calling in the academic journals a strategic paradox. On the one hand, the war, which was popular, allowed for this rapid development and transformation of Canadian foreign policy. But on the other hand, over the last 2 years, I mean, this transformation went on for 5 years with 4 dead Canadians that were killed by a misguided, laser-guided bomb, right? But then all of a sudden, Canada takes up the counterinsurgency in Kandahar and start dying 25 a summer, and now we're up to 100, and people are really concerned that maybe we're losing in Afghanistan, which is something for a peace movement we should really have our ear to the ground on. This concept of that our foreign policy might be just if we win, but is unjust if we lose. Now you can see the more that Canada loses, the more opposition there is to the war, as I think a very troubling trend, but one that can be exploited nonetheless, and that is that if too many people die, the project becomes unstomachable in Canada, And this sets back the transformation. This sets back the beyond Afghanistan, because people will say, what about Afghanistan? Sort of Vietnam syndrome, that Afghanistan will come to define Canadian foreign policy in a way that will prevent Canada from putting soldiers on the ground in South Lebanon, or or whatever the next conflict is, Somalia, Eritrea, Ethiopia, wherever it is that Canadian forces would go next.